Hey VH Bio students, this is Mr. Wolf, and in this videocast we'll be talking about cellular respiration. Now before we get into cellular respiration and its major parts, we first need to talk about the major molecules that we'll be looking at in cell respiration. And two of those major molecules are going to be glucose and carbon dioxide. So when you look at this structure of glucose, you can see there's a lot of carbon-to-carbon bonds, as signified by these little black lines, and a lot of carbon to hydrogen bonds. And we would say that glucose is a very high energy molecule because there are a lot of electrons kind of holding this molecule together. And with those electrons, we have a more complex molecule, therefore we have a much higher energy state in this molecule. Basically in science, higher energy is needed to build a more complicated or more complex molecule, whereas carbon dioxide, we only have a few bonds between the carbons and other things, and so we would say carbon dioxide is at a very low energy state. There's not many electrons, making this a very non-complex molecule, much more simple molecule, and a much lower energy molecule. So when looking at the steps of cell respiration, basically what the cell is doing is taking this very high energy complex molecule of glucose and breaking it down into a much more simple form of carbon, which is carbon dioxide. But in doing so, the cell is harnessing that energy and using it to create a more usable form, which is called ATP. And so you've already gone through several of these stages, but in this video cast, we're going to talk about those stages a little bit more in detail. So in this picture right here, you see we have, this is showing four major parts of cell respiration. We're actually going to combine two of them. We're going to combine steps 2 and 3 together and just call this the Krebs cycle. But as you can tell, the first part, glycolysis, takes place outside of the cell. So here you see the cytosol, which is another name for the cytoplasm. So this is outside of the, outside of the mitochondria, not the cell. And the rest of this takes place in the mitochondria, where we'll have the Krebs cycle and we'll have oxidative phosphorylation or electron transport chain. So let's go ahead and start talking about these reactions a little bit more in a simplified form. So first of all, here we have our mitochondria. So the mitochondria is a major organelle found in eukaryotic cells that's pretty much one of its major functions is to extract energy out of the food that we eat. So a couple things about the mitochondria. You have this intermembrane space, which I've drawn here, these like little red spikes. And then inside the mitochondria you have the matrix, and then you have outside the mitochondria, which is the cytoplasm, which is just part of the cell. So these mitochondria are going to be the main organelle involved in cell respiration. You also see our formula for cell respiration up here, the very simplified version. We're not going to be worrying about the prefixes or anything like that. Basically, just like in photosynthesis, we want you to understand, where glucose is being used and where oxygen is being used and where CO2 is being made and where H2O is being made, and of course what's going on with the energy involved in this. So first let's talk about glucose. So glucose starts out here in the cytoplasm, and in the cytoplasm the first reaction of cell respiration occurs, and this is called glycolysis. Basically glycolysis breaks glucose into two pyruvate molecules. Pyruvate is just a smaller, simpler form of a carbon molecule. Instead of having 6 carbons, we have 3 carbons in this pyruvate. So we've essentially already started breaking this molecule down, making it less complex and trying to extract some of that energy from it. So glycolysis is the first step of cell respiration, and this occurs out in the cytoplasm. Also, this step requires no oxygen involved. Notice oxygen is not being used yet. So one thing that we get from the pyruvate is we get ATP and a familiar looking molecule, NADH. We talked about NADH before in photosynthesis, and NADH just carries electrons. It carries energized electrons, and it's going to be used somewhere else in this pathway. And then the ATP, think of those just like batteries. They're batteries for the cell to use as a source of energy. So basically glycolysis, we break down glucose into pyruvate, we get some ATP from it, and we get NADH from it. Now, one big misconception I don't want you walking away from this video with is that we don't get energy by breaking bonds. We get energy by making molecules less complex. So it does require some energy to break glucose down initially. There's actually an input of ATP to get this started, but the output of energy is much greater, so we actually end up gaining more energy than we actually used to start the reaction. So the next thing that happens is that this pyruvate molecules end up in the mitochondria, and what goes on next is called the Krebs cycle. Now the Krebs cycle takes this pyruvate and further breaks it down. And what does it break it down into? A very simple form of carbon called carbon dioxide. So you can see the 3 carbons from pyruvate now end up being 3 separate carbon dioxide molecules, which is a much lower energy state, so we got some more energy by making this molecule less complex. So we got more energy in the form of ATP, and we've got some more energy in the form of NADH. The NADH, again, is going to be used later, and then the ATP is going to be used by the cell for its energy needs, and now we have our first waste product of the cell respiration process, carbon dioxide. That's the gas that we breathe out as waste, and that all comes from the breaking down of pyruvate during the Krebs cycle. Now, these NADHs are carrying these high energy electrons, so there's still energy available for us to use. So what happens is that these NADH trucks drop off their electrons at the inner membrane space of the mitochondria. And in that inner membrane space, you'll find electron carriers. And these electron carriers, we're not going to get into the details of them, but basically they're able to use those energized electrons that came originally from glucose and extract more energy from them and use them to make more ATP. So the electrons get incorporated into the electron transport chain along with our reactant, oxygen, and with this process, we spit out more ATP and our second waste product, water. In fact, the hydrogens from the NADHs and the electrons bond with the oxygen and create water as a waste product. This is why oxygen is needed for this reaction. The electron transport chain couldn't finish its job if it didn't have oxygen. So we couldn't get those ATPs and those NADHs being used if we did not have oxygen provided to our cells, which is exactly why we need to breathe. And so we do make ATP in all 3 steps of cell respiration. So in this slide, we're going to talk about where everything is being used and where everything is being made. So first of all, glucose is used in glycolysis, and then we make pyruvate, in fact 2 pyruvates at the end of glycolysis. And what we get in terms of energy is ATP. That pyruvate then moves on to the Krebs cycle, which is now in the mitochondria, and then we break it down even further. We get some more ATP, but we get our first waste product, carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is breathed out or diffuses out of the cell as waste. And then the last part, we use those energy electrons, those energized electrons from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, and with the combination of oxygen, we can get even more ATP out of the process, and our last waste product is made, and that's going to be our water. The big difference here is that the electron transport chain makes about 32 to 34 ATPs, whereas Krebs cycle and glycolysis only make 2 each. So the bulk of our energy needs comes from the electron transport chain, which requires oxygen to work. And so without that oxygen, we wouldn't get those 32 to 34 ATPs, and we would be left with just what comes from basically glycolysis, which is not enough for most of our cells to survive. So oxygen is essential for aerobic respiration because our cells rely on those 32 to 34 ATPs made by the electron transport chain. Now, don't get lost in the numbers. We're not going to require you to remember that there are 32 to 34 ATPs made in the electron transport chain. All you have to know is that there is a lot more energy with the use of oxygen than if we only had glycolysis alone. So that's how glucose is used as a main energy source in cell respiration. But I would like to point out that there are other pathways that we can use to get more energy. In this model, we can see that, of course, sugar, glucose, starts up here in glycolysis. But we can also use molecules called glycerol, which come from fats you eat. So when you digest fats, those glycerol molecules that make up those fats also enter this process through glycolysis. Now, when you eat proteins contain amino acids, and those amino acids can be converted into pyruvates and enter the process here. So we kind of skip the glycolysis stage when you start digesting proteins. Some amino acids and some fatty acids from fats also can enter this acetyl-CoA part at the beginning of the Krebs cycle. And then even some of the other amino acids found in proteins enter at the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, as we referred to earlier. So basically, it's not just glucose that we use as an energy source. All the food you eat somehow enters this pathway at some stage and is used in the process of generating ATP for our cells. So that's cellular respiration. Thanks for watching.